Well, shooters and reloaders out there, Fortune Cookie 45LC coming to you for the Hot Lead Zone. And have you noticed that items like these that weigh our powder charges form the basis of the safety of an entire industry? That is reloading. And it's always been that way. Going back as far as we can remember in reloading, we use scales like these, whether it's balance beam or digital, and that allows us to reload safely because we can measure the powder charges, so it's critical. Now, we have a tendency as reloaders to take these scales, these instruments, and think that they are absolute dead-on, spot-on accurate. So when we throw a 10-grain charge, we often think in the back of our mind, without really considering it, that these are giving us exactly 10 grains. And this is in spite of the fact that the manufacturers tell us that these scales are accurate to plus or minus 1/10 of a grain, which means that when we weigh a 10-grain charge, it's not 10 grains, it's either 9.9 to 10.1. But we don't ever think of that. We think it's 10 grains. Well, what we're going to do is use this milligram scale that's used by pharmaceutical industry and also the jewelry industry that need a higher degree of accuracy. So this will actually weigh to the 100th of a grain. And we're going to use this little scale here to demonstrate the 1/10 plus or minus that these scales will give us. What we're doing here to demonstrate this phenomena of our powder scale accuracy is we're going to go ahead and weigh 3.5 grains of very fine powder. That's Winchester 296. 3.5 grains. Get that balanced off as closely, as precisely as we can, because we're trickling with a very fine grain powder. And then we're going to go ahead and put the charges into our milligram scale here, which reads to the 100th of a grain, and see what kind of accuracy we get. So far I've done 3, and instead of 3.5 grains, we're getting 3.56. Then the second try we got 3.58, and the third try we got 3.64 grains in measured by the milligram scale. But this scale back here gave us a 3.5 grain reading. So we zero the RCBS 510 scale between every throw, and we're going to go ahead and set this for 3.5 grains. So there you see the 3.5 grains. Then we carefully trickle until we get that scale balanced as perfectly as we can. So there's a parallax-free shot of that 3.5 grain charge. Let's put it into the milligram scale. Okay, now let's take that charge carefully from the RCBS 510 scale to this milligram scale. And we'll pour it in and tap all the granules down. See what it reads there? 3.62. So we'll add that to our readings that we've done. And see what kind of, I guess the air currents, 3.60. Call it 3.60, the air currents. Okay, so here we go again. So you'll be able to see this now as we're doing it. So there's our milligram scale. We move the trickler off. It's zeroed at 3.5 grains. Bring the powder charge over here. Pour it into the pan. Knock it in. And we're getting 3.56 grains on this particular run. 3.56. So after doing this 10 times, you see the low is 3.48 grains and the high is 3.64. So we're looking at 0.16 variation. So a total variation fluctuation of 0.16. Well, we've heard that these scales are accurate to plus or minus 0.1 or 1/10 of a grain. Well, plus or minus is a 0.20 and we're getting a 0.16, so it jives pretty well. However, that plus or minus 1/10 of a grain standard works very well for our powders because of the size of granules, this kind of thing, that more accuracy than that doesn't really serve us. That plus or minus 1/10 of a grain is perfectly safe and allows us to load accurate ammunition that works very safely and well for us. Now these of course are powder measures, and they are also rated at 1/10 plus or minus accuracy. They throw the powder, don't weigh it, and because of that reason we don't trust these as well as we do the scales, even though the scales are also rated at 1/10 grain plus or minus. We're always double checking these with the scale. Now, thanks to E. Cleveland 1 and Murphy MB for a recent thread on powder measuring and powder scaling and this kind of thing, that question can be asked, if all of these are rated at 1/10 plus or minus accuracy, then why are we told that when we do maximum charges that we should weigh every charge? And that we're always checking measures like this against these scales as if these can't be trusted for a 1/10 plus or minus accuracy, but these can be trusted for like absolute spot-on accuracy. There's a very good reason for that. Let's go into it. So here's the reason. When we use our scales, whether it's digital or balance beam, and we set it for 10 grain charge, we're plus or minus 1/10 of a grain. And if we're doing a 22 grain charge of 2400 powder and 44 magnum, that's a maximum load. It's been figured out in the industry, in the reloading manuals, that 1/10 either way is fine. It's safe. The problem is when we use our powder measures, that the powder measure is not once removed from the 10 grains, it's twice removed. Because it's possible for the powder measure to throw a charge, and then we check it with the scale, and the scale could be off by 1/10, and the powder measure happens to agree with it there, but the powder measure is also inaccurate to 1/10, so the measure is out here. And then sometimes when we double check our powder measure to the scale, we don't get perfect zero agreement, and we think we're off by 1/10, and we accept that, but that throws the error even farther out to here. Now recently, Loads of Bacon was telling me how one of his powder measures was off by ½ grain, and when he told me that, I told him that it was totally unacceptable. And the reason, of course, being that when you're off by ½ a grain compared to what your scale is giving you, then the error is clear at the end of the yardstick. Now this gives you an idea why we have higher standard deviations of our ammunition when all we do is use powder measures. And if we want the best lowest standard deviation, we're going to use a scale, because then our error is 2/10 of a grain, not the end of the yardstick. Now I'm sure that inherently or experientially, most of us reloaders have come to understand this, but for all of you new reloaders out there, now it's crystal clear that we can actually see why this all is. So good reloading to all of you out there. Bye for now.